Hey kids, welcome back to Rob's Guide to Hearts of Iron 3. This episode we're going to be talking about naval units, naval statistics, and how to organize your fleets. So I've loaded up my Operation Unthinkable save here from my UK Let's Play, which is I'm going to be continuing this at some point and invading the Soviet Union, so just shout out to other stuff going on this channel. But let's dive in here. So I've loaded up the save because I have unlocked all of the naval units. Keep in mind that some of these statistics will not necessarily be representative. For example, I haven't really done much research on submarines, probably none at all in fact, so some of the stats you'll see here will not necessarily reflect what you'll see in game, but that's always the case. Depending on what text you research, your units will have different stats. Right. So, let's start by talking about the different types of ships. Maybe we'll start with transport. So, there's three types of transports. At the beginning of the game, most countries will only have access to the basic transports. The basic transport is basically a defenseless ship. It is used to move troops around the map, and it's not particularly good for amphibious invasions. It can be used for amphibious operations, but it will take longer, and there's, if your ships do get intercepted, they will be, likely to be sunk if they're not heavily guarded. And even if they are guarded, they'll still, the transports you may lose some. So risky to be using them for anything but moving troops around overseas. Landing craft are unlocked around 1940 usually, and they are a little bit more defensible than transports, and so they're a better option to be used for amphibious invasions. And they also have a higher transport capacity. Assault ships are the sort of end game. Assault ships are sort of the end game amphibious assault ship, and they are more able to defend themselves. They're just basically better landing crafts. Not much more to say about them. You don't necessarily often build these unless the game goes quite late. So into like 1945 or so. A lot of players will never see this unit on the map. Submarines are an inexpensive convoy raiding ship. They are pretty much no good at combat with any other ship type, but they are also very stealthy, so they are not easy to spot. They are typically used by countries that don't field large surface fleets or have access to aircraft carriers, although they could be useful in the late game, especially as their range and their statistics get better. But they're pretty self-explanatory. A lot of people debate whether they're worth building at all. They might be. We'll talk about strategies when I'm going to do a video on naval combat where I'll get into viable strategies for actually using your navy. But suffice to say that it is a somewhat viable strategy to build a lot of submarines and to get very advanced submarines and harass the enemy that way. But you're probably going to need a surface fleet at some point to do things like cross an ocean and invade the United States or something, even if you're playing as Germany. So yeah, there are two types of escort ships: destroyers and light cruisers. Destroyers are the smallest and weakest warship in the game, but they're very cheap to build. They are somewhat specialized in hunting submarines as well. And they are generally a kind of defensive ship, so you use them to protect your bigger ships essentially, and they're also somewhat disposable because they're cheap. They're the cheapest ship to build, so you can build them in great numbers, and they can provide protection for your capital ships, and they sort of specialize in. They're a sort of shorter range ship that specializes in submarine hunting. Light cruisers are the more powerful escort ship. They are a much longer range ship than destroyers. They are better at doing damage to enemy ships, and they are particularly good at anti-aircraft as well. So they're the best. They are the best ship for air defense. So they're definitely a very powerful option for escorts. Going into capital ships now, I'll start with the surface ships, and then I'll move on to carriers. I'll talk about carriers separately. So there are three types of surface capital ships. There are battleships, battlecruisers, and heavy cruisers. Important thing to note, heavy cruisers share the same practical as light cruisers. Heavy cruisers are almost kind of like a hybrid capital ship escort. They are considered a capital ship in the game, but they are the cheapest capital ship to build. They're also the weakest. They don't have as much armor, and they don't have as much armor, and they don't have as big guns, so they're not going to do as much damage, but they're cheap to build. They're also the fastest capital ship, so they do have their advantages. Battlecruisers are kind of a hybrid between heavy cruisers and battleships. They are faster than battleships, but they don't have the armor and the big guns, although they are more powerful than heavy cruisers. They're also more expensive to build, and they do not share a practical with light cruisers and heavy cruisers. They use the same practical as battleships. So yeah. Battleships are the most powerful ship in the game in terms of guns and armor. They're the most heavily armored ship in the game. I realize I don't have the super heavy battleship. That's basically inspired by the Japanese Yamato class ships. Super heavy battleships are kind of a weird one because you unlock them in 1938, and their stats never improve over the course of the game, so they will sort of always be a 1938 model of ship. And they're very, very, very expensive to build. They take a long time to build, and they're basically just, bigger battleships with buff statistics. But yeah, so that's another thing to keep in mind. There is a fourth capital ship type. But yeah, battleships are the most powerful ship probably at the very start of the game, but they will very quickly become eclipsed by air power, as happened historically. So any of these capital ships, if they run into an aircraft carrier, they're probably not going to be able to sink it for a variety of reasons that I'll talk to as I get into naval statistics. But at the beginning of the game, you are going to be forced to choose whether you want to invest IC and techs into building one or two of these three types of capital ships, or whether you just want to go straight for aircraft carriers. Countries like Germany and Italy that start with no carrier technology, it will be a long road for them to get carriers, but it may be worthwhile, because at the end of the day, if you start to do long-range naval operations where you're trying to do things like invade the USA, or even just operate distant overseas and fighting the Royal Navy or the US Navy, if you do not have a way of delivering air power across long distances in the map, your fleets will run into trouble. So for most countries, it's probably worth investing in carriers. There are a few ways to use these heavier surface ships without building carriers. And it's certainly cheaper battleships, even though they take a long time to build and they're very expensive. They end up being cheaper than carriers, because when you build carriers, you have to build the carrier air groups as well. So they're expensive. They take a long time to build, and you also have to build two CAG units to fill them, right? So let's talk about carriers now briefly. There's two types. There's carriers and escort carriers. Escort carriers can only carry one carrier air group. Carriers can carry two. Carriers have better statistics in every category pretty much than escort carriers, except for one or two. Escort carriers are an interesting ship, especially early on. They can help nations that don't have the technology to build carriers. They can be kind of a first step to building carriers and working up your carrier practical, so that's useful. They can also escort capital ships, which carriers cannot do. So if you start with a modest surface fleet, putting escort carriers into that fleet is kind of an interesting stopgap, which will allow your navy to operate in areas where the enemy might have carriers. So an escort carrier might prevent, for if you're playing as Germany, for example, building 1 or 2 escort carriers might prevent your fleet from being sunk or badly damaged by a Royal Navy carrier or a US Navy carrier. At the end of the day, though, you're not going to be able to defeat carriers with escort carriers. They are much more likely to be sunk. And they just don't have the range and the speed to be the mainstay of your navy. Escort carriers can also be very good for hunting submarines. In fact, in many ways, the escort carrier is the best submarine hunting vessel in the game if you can afford them. And if sub hunting is important to you, so this could be the case for the United Kingdom, the United States, and also Japan, because people often forget that Japan will have problems with submarines as they are at war with the United States. The United States does build submarines, and they will be sinking your convoys. So, escort carriers, definitely a useful unit to keep in mind. But the be-all and end-all of the Navy in this game is the mainline fleet carrier. There are only a few nations that start the game with the ability to build these. France, the UK, the United States, and Japan are. I think that's it. It's those 4. Yeah. These carriers are basically almost impossible to sink. The only way you're going to sink a carrier is using air power, basically, in this game. Of course, in the war, some carriers were sunk by submarines and other, surface ships and stuff like that. But, at the end of the day, once they learned how to use carriers properly in the war, in reality, very, very few of them were sunk by conventional means. They were sunk by aircraft, essentially, whether it was kamikazes or airstrikes from other carriers or land-based forces. It's really reasonably realistic in the sense that if you are going up against the fleet with carriers and you do not either have really good air cover or carriers yourself, you will not be able to win. They're a very, very long-range ship. They allow you to deliver air power to remote parts of the map, and so yeah, carriers are going to be probably the end game goal of any navy in this game, and even the Axis powers like Germany and Italy will not be able to deliver air power and naval power outside, far off of the coast, basically, unless they build carriers. So, more on that as we talk about statistics. Let's go through the statistics in order, just like we've done for air and land units. We'll start with organization. For air units and land units, organization is in many ways almost the most important statistic. It is not quite as much for naval units. Certainly, organization, your ships will flee when they run out of organization, and the individual ships within a fleet will flee if they run out of organization. But that's not that big a deal because sometimes when ships flee, that avoids them getting destroyed. The more important statistic is positioning, and we'll get to that. But certainly, organization, you're going to increase it by doctrines, and it is a somewhat important. It is a somewhat important statistic. It will help your carriers and your very powerful ships stay in combat and deliver more damage before fleeing. It may also, though, just push them to stay in combat until they themselves are destroyed. So, interesting statistic, not the most important for naval units. Convoy attack is pretty self-explanatory. Convoy attack is your ability to attack enemy convoys. Convoys, of course, ship supplies and resources across the map. So if you are able to destroy enough convoys, first of all, you force your enemy to put a lot of IC into replenishing their convoys, and you can also potentially create resource shortages or supply bottlenecks by doing so. And submarines are going to be your best convoy hunters in the game. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that particularly the heavy cruisers and battleships and battlecruisers do have a high convoy attack. So if you are a country that has plenty of that starts the game with plenty of convoy plenty of heavy ships, you may not need to build submarines. You will still be able to sink enemy convoys. You don't even need to use the convoy hunting mission. So a nation like, say, the United Kingdom may not want to bother with submarines, because you're going to be able to sink a fair number of enemy convoys without submarines, just using your existing fleets. Typically you rely on submarines when you don't have these heavy ships, and you need something else to go and do your convoy hunting for you, and when you need a stealthy ship that's not going to get caught. But yeah, so something to keep in mind: you don't need submarines to do convoy hunting. Sea attack. Sea attack is basically the guns on your ship. The highest sea attack will go to battleships. You'll notice that carriers don't have any sea attack. That's because carriers do damage to enemy ships using their carrier air groups. So obviously, it goes battleships, battlecruisers, heavy cruisers, and super heavy battleships will have the highest sea attack until if you continue to increase the tech of battleships, they will actually eclipse super heavy battleships at some point. Submarine attack. Submarine attack is a fairly important statistic. It represents your ASW techniques, hedgehogs, and the like. The only ships that really have submarine attack are destroyers and light cruisers, and to a much lesser degree heavy cruisers. But if you want to use ships to hunt submarines, you should probably use destroyers, because they get much bigger increases in submarine attack as the game progresses. Especially in the early game, submarines are going to be your best bet. So that's pretty simple. Air attack, as I mentioned, light cruisers have very good air attack. Heavy cruisers also have very good air attack, which is worth keeping in mind. Because a lot of the big naval powers start the game with a handful of heavy cruisers, and even if you're not going to be investing in heavy cruisers, it's not such a bad idea to upgrade their anti-aircraft, because they will give your fleets a little bit of a buffer against naval bombers or carrier air groups. So something to keep in mind. Light cruisers are going to be your best air attack units, but heavy cruisers are also useful. Another thing to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, no amount of air attack or air defense is going to be sufficient. If your enemy has good naval bombers, you are going to need actual air cover in the form of interceptors, multi-rolls, or carrier air groups in order to fend off those naval bombers and carrier air groups doing naval strikes or what have you. So you are going to need proper air coverage, but these air attack and air defense statistics will give you a little bit of a buffer and do a little bit more damage to the enemy aircraft's org and strength when they attack you. I'll cover off air defense at the same time. It's not really worth distinguishing between air attack and air defense. The same techs increase both of these at the same time. There is a difference, obviously. Air attack basically does damage to the enemy aircraft, which shortens the amount of time that they'll spend doing the bombing run and will make them run away faster. Air defense will mitigate the amount of damage they do. At the end of the day, these two statistics are basically tied together, so there's not much of a distinction between them. Shore bombardment. Shore bombardment is a very interesting statistic. It does not upgrade over the course of the game, but all of the capital ships, as well as light cruisers, have shore bombardments. This is one of the reasons why, if you have World War I battleships, like level 1 or very out-of-date battlecruisers and battleships, you should keep them around. Don't necessarily use them in high-risk naval engagements, but keep them around, because they would be very good to mix into an invasion fleet, for example, or to use if you are, say, Germany and you're fighting the Soviet Union on sort of near Leningrad, or if you are the Soviet Union defending somewhere like Leningrad or along these coastal areas here. Using those rusty old battleships for shore bombardments can be a really good strategy, and it's a substantial combat boost. I think it's a 10% combat boost you get from just having a battleship in an adjacent province. So definitely worth keeping in mind. Don't forget about shore bombardments. It makes a lot of those older capital ships really worth their while. So keep those older capital ships around and use them for shore bombardment. Sea defense. Sea defense, because of the way that screens work, you'll notice that destroyers and light cruisers have much higher sea defense than any of the other capital ships, including battleships. Sea defense is not armor. It represents the kind of maneuverability of these destroyers and light cruisers and their ability to prevent your heavier ships from being engaged and damaged. So this is why, even though destroyers don't really have much firepower, they are actually the best defensive ship. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing to use destroyers as your main escorts. But yeah, these will prevent your ships from being damaged. And so it's an important statistic to keep in mind. Air defense we already talked about with air attack. Surface detection. Surface detection when your navies are patrolling around. When your navies are patrolling around in sea provinces and they enter a sea province, unlike land provinces, when two opposing units try and enter a land province, they immediately enter combat. When ships enter a sea province, they do not necessarily find and engage the enemy. Sea provinces are considered to be fairly large areas. You can see visibly on the map they're much larger than land provinces. So if you do not have good surface detection, you may not find the enemy, and you may not ever engage them. So good to keep in mind. It's usually increased by some of the radar technologies. Air detection. Air detection is the ability to detect bombers before they do their bombing run. Like I said, like most of the air statistics, at the end of the day, you're going to need land-based or carrier-based aircraft to properly defend your ships against naval bombers. So certainly a somewhat useful statistic, but at the end of the day, like I said, what it may help you to do, for example, if your submarines have good air detection, it will prompt them to flee before they are heavily bombed. So not a decent statistic, but not the most important. It's probably more important to just have proper air cover. Submarine detection is a very important statistic. Submarines are particularly hard to spot, so in the early game, you will be, if you are playing as the UK or Germany, you are going to be in an arms race in terms of the UK will get better submarine and better submarine detection and submarine attack. And Germany will get faster, longer range submarines, and so as the game progresses, you will definitely want to be increasing the submarine detection skills of your destroyers in particular. But you can see here, light cruisers at the end of the day are even though they come second best in terms of submarine attack and submarine detection, at the end of the day they are not going to be particularly effective sub hunters. It's going to be your destroyers and then later your carrier air groups and naval bombers that are going to be doing your sub hunting. Visibility. Visibility is a very important statistic. Bigger ships, heavier ships are easier to spot. Keep in mind that transport ships have a particularly high visibility, so they are not going to be able to hide from enemy ships. And just in general, even the assault ships and landing crafts have a fairly high visibility as well. So the more ships you have in a fleet and the bigger ships you have in a fleet, the harder it is going to be for that fleet to kind of slip by unnoticed. This is why submarines are particularly good at sub-hunting for countries that are trying to avoid naval engagements with more powerful navies. Something to keep in mind, though, visibility. Transport capability is pretty self-evident. Assault ships and landing crafts can have a carry weight of 60. Transports have a carry weight of 40. One thing to keep in mind, it's a little bit tricky to calculate transport weights. So the way to do it, if you select 2 or more units and you hover over this this button here, even if they're not in a sea province, if we select 2 or more land units, you can get the transport weight of those units. So we can see 65. So these guys would need at least 2 transports or 2 landing craft. But yeah, it's a little bit tricky to calculate because every single brigade type has a different transport weight, so artillery is heavier than, I don't know, an infantry brigade or whatever. So I don't think it's worthwhile memorizing those. Just keep in mind that you're going to need maybe six or seven or eight regular transport ships to carry, for example, an armored corps. You'll get used to roughly what you need to carry different types of units. Generally speaking, you should simply try and have extra transports. In general, almost all nations are going to need some form of transport at some point. Max mission range, pretty self-evident. It allows your ships to operate longer range. One thing to keep in mind is that just like air units, the lowest max mission range of the ships in a fleet will determine the max mission range for the entire fleet. So it's not an average or anything like that. If you mix in low-range destroyers with your super long-range carriers, the carriers will not be able to use all their range. So something to keep in mind. Firing distance, very important statistic. Firing distance. The bigger ships with bigger guns have a longer firing distance because when you detect, basically the way naval combat works is you move. If you detect and spot a ship, you then have to get within firing distance to actually fire on them. If the enemy's fleet is smaller and set to passive or defensive stance, it will try and run. So essentially, it's a compromise between speed, which is this next statistic, and firing distance in terms of getting your big ships into range to fire on the enemy. This is also true when you're trying to, say, sink battleships. You will need a mix of fast ships to get within range to actually fire on them, and other powerful ships to actually do damage, and you have to get into firing distance to actually hit enemy ships. Carriers, you'll notice carriers have a sort of like maxed out 10,000 firing distance. 10,000 is bigger than the size of NEC province, so the firing distance of carriers is unlimited, and that is because it is their aircraft that are doing the strikes. So carriers, this is one of the reasons that they're almost impervious to sea attack, because their carrier air groups will almost always strike the enemy before any ships are able to get within firing range of them. Of course, if those carrier air groups lose all of their organization or their strength, then those ships will be open to attack. So when you actually want to sink carriers, you typically have to defeat their air groups before you can actually attack the carrier and sink it. Speed, destroyers are the fastest ship. After which you have light cruisers. Carriers are the fastest capital ship by the end of the game, and then you have heavy cruisers, battlecruisers, and battleships. Escort carriers are substantially slower than carriers, and that's one of the reasons why even though they have that unlimited firing range like the carriers, they will often get sort of chased and caught by heavier ships and sunk. So something to keep in mind. Movement speeds for ships are an average of the speed of individual ships. So it's unlike land units. You are not slowed down by the slowest ship in the fleet. The total movement speed of the fleet is an average of all the ships in the fleet, and that's something to keep in mind in fleet composition, which we'll talk about in this video. Hull size. Hull size is the equivalent of strength for ships. The bigger the hull size in general, the more IC it will take to build the ship, the more IC it will take to repair the ship as well. So if you have a battleship that gets badly damaged, it will take a substantial amount of IC just to repair it. It will take a long time to repair it. Hull size also tends to indicate more visibility as well, and has to do with positioning as well, and we'll talk about that afterwards. Positioning determines basically how good your ships are at getting into position to fire at valuable targets, and also how good your screens are at protecting your capital ships from being attacked. It also represents friendly fire. If you have very poor positioning in a fleet, you will typically end up with a lot of ships being damaged by friendly fire. So positioning is probably the most important naval statistic, and it's increased by doctrines and various other texts, as well as having good leaders, so a very important statistic. Supply consumption and fuel consumption work the same as for land and naval units. Pay attention to what port your ships are based in, because if that port is not big enough, or if the infrastructure leading up to that port is not good, then you may not be able to supply, for example, a large carrier fleet. Also keep in mind that the carrier air groups on your carriers also consume fuel and supplies. So even though some of these ships actually I think, yeah, look, these landing craft and assault ships actually consume more fuel than carriers. Carriers do actually consume more fuel because their aircraft also needs fuel and supplies. So, and generally speaking, the bigger ships require more fuel and supplies, as you would expect. Although, like I said, these transport ships do consume a lot of fuel. Officers, just like for air units, naval units do not consume officers, which is a little bit of a weird, I think it's a bit of an oversight, to be honest. Anyway, IC and build time. So it's very important that you make decisions about what kind of fleet you're going to build right away in 1936, because some of the larger capital ships, carriers and battleships and battlecruisers, can take up to 2 years to build. So you need to decide what research you're doing and get those ships in your production queue as soon as possible. Otherwise, you will not have those ships deployed on the map in time for the war. And if you're going to be building more capital ships throughout the campaign, you do need to pay a lot more attention to the timing of when you build your capital ships and the timing of the research and when you improve their statistics, than for air units and land units. Keep in mind that a lot of ships do not receive upgrades. You are not able to upgrade the armor or guns on your ships, or the engine. So you will not be able to make them faster, have more heavily armored, or have bigger guns. So there are some statistics that you're able to upgrade. I'll look at that briefly, but yeah, you need to be very strategic about the timing of when you start building these ships. And just like air units, it's important to remember that ships do consume manpower. So but generally speaking, they consume a lot less manpower than land units. So it's not that big a factor. In fact, countries that have a bit of a manpower shortage, especially like say the United Kingdom at the beginning of the game, the United Kingdom's manpower is not going to grow as quickly as Germany. Might not be a bad idea to focus a bit more on your Navy and your Air Force than on building a huge number of land units, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to run out of manpower if you try and use a huge army anyway. So anyway, that's all good things to keep in mind. Let's look very quickly at those upgrades, like I mentioned. So if we take, for example, this is a very out of date escort carrier. We can see that the engine, the armor, and the hangar cannot be upgraded, where the radar and the anti-aircraft armament can. And the same would go for these other ships. They're very similar. Engine and armor can't be upgraded. Main armament can't be upgraded. But the radar techs and the anti-aircraft can. And the same would apply for battleships. Submarines. Submarines, you are able to upgrade the torpedoes, so their attack will increase. You are not, however, able to upgrade their hull or their engine, so they won't get faster and they won't get stronger. Anti-aircraft, sonar, air warning equipment, acoustic torpedo, and torpedoes can be upgraded, so some of those older subs may not be completely useless. Okay, so let's now talk about fleet composition. And how to put your navies into effective fleets. I've loaded up the 1936 scenario as the United Kingdom, and I have moved all of the Navy to Dover. I am going to now merge the Navy, and we'll use this as an example to talk about different fleet compositions. Obviously, keep in mind that if you're playing as a country with a very weak Navy at the start of the game, like Germany, or even to a lesser degree Italy, you will have to be a little bit more careful, and you will not have the luxury of using some of the more vulnerable types of fleets. Powerful naval countries like the UK, actually really just the UK and the USA, are able to spread their fleet thin to try and cover the most ground, whereas countries like Germany and Italy and even Japan are going to have to be much more careful and make sure that they do not expose their fleet to attack, because they cannot afford to take heavy naval losses in the way that the USA and the UK can. So yeah, the UK and the USA are going to want to spread their fleets out a bit more to cover more ground, because they can afford to take losses, whereas Germany and Italy and Japan will need to be careful about making sure that each individual fleet is strong and can fend for itself, because they simply cannot afford to take losses. So something to keep in mind. Let's talk about a few of the factors that you're going to take into consideration when you design a fleet. So first of all, let's talk about screen ratio. So you need to have, if you have less than the same, you need to have the same number of screens or capital ships, or more screens than capital ships. If I remove one of those destroyers, we have 5 capital ships and 4 screens, and you're gonna have a positioning penalty from not having enough screens. This will make your valuable capital ships that take 2 years to build vulnerable to attack. So make sure you have at least as many screens as you do capital ships. In fact, you may want to have, you generally want to have 1 or 2 extra screens. So either light cruisers or destroyers, 1 or 2 extra screens in case you lose one in a battle, so that if that fleet gets engaged again, it will not be fighting with a penalty from not having enough screens. So screen ratio is a very important thing to keep in mind. The other thing that you want to consider when you're designing fleets is, or one of the other things, is visibility. The more ships you have in a fleet, the more visible it is to the enemy. So, a giant doom stack, is going to be very powerful, but it's also going to be very easy to spot. So if you are playing, for example, as Germany, you may not want to put all of your fleet in one stack and try and move it, for example, to another port. If you've conquered France, moving your fleet all in one big stack might be a little bit dangerous. Even though that fleet might be more defensible, it will also be very easy to stack, and it'll be very easy to spot. And if your enemy has a very powerful navy like the Royal Navy, they will, if they spot the fleet, they will rush many fleets, and will, their doom stack will be bigger than yours. So it may be better to try and move smaller groups of fleets, smaller groups of ships in a more stealthy way. And this is particularly important when you think about submarine warfare and anti-submarine warfare. Another thing to keep in mind is that if enemy fleets meet a much larger foe, like they will run away. So using very large fleets may not be the most effective way of hunting submarines and things like that, because your enemy will simply run away. So something to keep in mind. Visibility is a pretty big factor. Mission range is another factor. So if I mix these carriers that have a range of 3,100 with these outdated destroyers that have a range of 1,500 kilometers, the carriers will not be able to use their full range. The range of the fleet will be 1,500 kilometers. So you may want something you want to take into consideration. Now, if you don't need to be operating at very long distances, mixing carriers and destroyers is not necessarily a bad idea, because if I'm using this carrier squadron in the North Sea, for example, I'm not really going to need to worry about the mission range. These older or destroyers are, not necessarily going to be a problem. The same goes for speed. As I said, speed is an average, so one thing to keep in mind, for example, if you're using battleships as a capital ship, they're very slow ships. We can see here 18.5 or 18 kilometers per hour. If I decide to mix in some destroyers, even though these destroyers are not going to be as strong as light cruisers, they are going to speed up the battleships, which will allow you to chase down fleeing enemies or to run away from a fight that you don't want to be in. So speed is also important. Let's now talk about one of the most important aspects of fleet composition, and that is kind of a hidden statistic, and it's called priority. You don't really see priority on the map, but you'll notice that the ships in this giant stack here are all in order, in the sense that the carriers are at the top and the transports and subs and everything are at the bottom. So basically, if I make a fleet that looks something like this, let's put in, you'll notice that if I put these ships into the fleet in a different order, they still will appear in the stack in the order that they're in here. And that is because every type of ship is given a priority score, and that determines how valuable the target is, and that also determines the way in which the ships will defend each other. So the destroyers will basically try and screen the light cruisers, which will basically try and screen the heavy cruisers, and the escort carriers all the way up to carriers. And this is why you never mix carriers and capital ships. You should never mix carriers with battleships, battlecruisers, or heavy cruisers. The reason for that is because if this fleet is engaged, the battleship, battlecruiser, and heavy cruisers will be soaking up damage to protect the carrier, and the carrier has a firing range of 10,000, as we discussed. So the last thing you want is for your valuable battleships to rush forward and expose themselves to enemy fire when the carrier's aircraft are actually doing all of the attacking anyway. So for that reason, there are two types of your mainline fleets, and that is your carrier task forces or carrier fleets, and what I would call your battle fleets or your surface action groups. Keep your carriers and other capital ships in separate fleets. Very important. There is, however, an exception to that rule. You'll notice that when I put an escort carrier in this fleet, it has a lower priority than your battleships and battlecruisers. So it is viable to mix escort carriers in with battlecruisers and battleships, not with heavy cruisers though. The heavy cruisers will start to act as an escort if they are in a fleet with an escort carrier, so this is a great way to lose heavy cruisers. Make sure, of course, that you have the right screen ratio. Escort carriers are not screens, they are capital ships, but a fleet like this is viable, and that escort carrier will actually provide some better air coverage for the capital ships above it. So that's one exception. Other than that, do not mix carriers in with other capital ships. If we look at, so we talked about how each ship has a positioning score. The positioning is going to be increased by doctrine techs. Not only does each ship have a positioning score, but there is a maximum number of ships that you can put in a fleet before you get a positioning penalty. And because, as I said, positioning is a very, very important statistic. So the positioning penalty it results from, let's find it here. The positioning penalty results from the hull size of the ships. So you will get a positioning penalty if your hull size is above 16. So you do not necessarily want to be using giant doom stacks because they'll get a very bad positioning penalty. Something to keep in mind. You can mitigate the positioning penalty by having a high skill admiral. So a skill 5 admiral, I believe, is going to decrease the positioning penalty by a certain percentage. I can't remember what it is, but you will be able to use bigger and bigger fleets as your admirals get more skilled. Another thing to keep in mind is the rank of your admiral. 1-star admirals can effectively command 6 ships. For 2 stars, it's 12 ships. For 3 stars, it's 18 ships. And for 4 stars, it's 30 ships. One thing to keep in mind is that 1-star admirals gain experience faster than 2-star, faster than 3-star, faster than 4-star. So in the early game especially, it may be a good idea to try and field some smaller fleets so that your valuable high-skill admirals can increase in skill faster, but it's a compromise because your small fleets will be vulnerable to enemy attack. So yeah. So you know, something to keep in mind. Now let's look at specific fleet types. Let's start with the classic battle fleet. One thing that you will see a lot of on forums is you know, always mix your battleships with destroyers, and always mix your carriers with light cruisers. There's a couple reasons for this. Battleships and destroyers use the same doctrines. And carriers and light cruisers use the same doctrines. So, you know, keep in mind that it's perfectly okay to mix light cruisers and battleships, but as long as you're going to research both the carrier doctrine and the doctrine that covers battleships and destroyers. So the only reason that you would not mix light cruisers with battleships is if you're only researching the one doctrine. Otherwise, there's, you know, destroyers are a good mix of battleships because they increase the speed, but they are not, you know, you don't necessarily have to hold to that. It's not necessarily a bad idea to mix in different escort types within your battle fleets, as long as you're researching the appropriate doctrines. Mixing screen types can actually be a good thing because you're able to get some of the sea attack from the light cruisers, some of the anti-air from the light cruisers, while you're getting the speed of the destroyers and the sea defense from the destroyers. So if you are going to be researching a lot of the naval doctrines and you're going to have a very versatile navy with different types of ships, then mixing escort types is not necessarily a bad thing. The same goes for mixing, with the exception of carriers, as I discussed. The same goes for mixing in, say, heavy cruisers or battle cruisers with your battleships. You will get the speed of the heavy cruisers. You'll get the big guns of the battleships and the armor of the battleships. So not necessarily a bad idea to mix in different types of capital ships and to mix in different types of escorts. Heavy cruisers, as discussed, also have a pretty good air defense and air attack statistics, as do battle cruisers. So not such a bad idea to throw some heavy cruisers into your battle fleets. The other thing is that most nations don't start with, you know, most nations don't, like the United Kingdom and the USA, start with a dozen or so battleships. You may not, you know, it may not be very effective to put all of your battleships in the same fleet. You may get more mileage out of them if you mix them into smaller fleets, and reinforce those fleets using the cheaper heavy cruisers. So something to keep in mind. Most countries are also not going to build a lot of battleships because they're expensive and because they're not necessarily a good long-term investment. So your mix of capital ships could look something like this, or even something like this. Right, so how big should your fleets be? How big should your surface action groups be? Well, one approach would be to simply make them as big as you can without getting a positioning penalty. So let's mix in some light cruisers, some destroyers. We can see that with, if we put in something like 7, we've already said that we have to keep our screen ratio correct, and we want to have a few extra screens. If we put in 7 capital ships and 10 escorts, we get a pretty substantial 14.5% positioning penalty. So, you know, what we can do is we can start taking out a few ships here until we get rid of that positioning penalty. If we take out, with with 6 capital ships and 7 screens, we have a 0% positioning penalty. Keep in mind, you don't see the score, but keep in mind that we could maybe add some of those ships back if we had like a skill 6 or 7 admiral. But yeah, but as I said, we need a 2-star admiral, or sorry, a 3-star admiral to use this fleet. So this admiral will gain skill a lot slower. So I tend to, in the early game, I would tend to try and avoid fielding fleets that are larger than 12 ships. So I would probably take out one of these battleships or heavy cruisers. I find that a 5 to 7 ratio is roughly perfect, because it allows you to use a vice admiral or a 2-star admiral instead of a 3-star admiral. And that allows you to have your admiral gain skill faster. Obviously, for Germany and Italy and Japan, you may wish to simply put more ships in your fleets with a high skill admiral to avoid having your fleet destroyed in a kind of piecemeal way by the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy. But I do find that the 12-ship surface action group is particularly good in the early game. And if you have the luxury of researching a lot of naval techs, mixing light cruisers and destroyers is not such a bad idea, because you get a mix of all of the statistics and stuff like that. So this would be a pretty good surface action fleet. Obviously, if you're only going to research certain types of ships, then I would stick to either destroyers or light cruisers. If you're going to take advantage of the synergy in terms of practicals between heavy cruisers and light cruisers, then obviously your surface action fleets are going to look something like this. Oh, sorry. Something like this. Obviously, mixing these older ships in with these newer ships will limit the range of the ships. If you don't need to operate at longer ranges, it's perfectly reasonable to use some of these older screens, especially. It's also not the end of the world to use some older ships. Even level 1 battleships are pretty powerful, so if you have a couple of those sitting around, throwing one into one of these fleets is going to give you a bonus, even if you haven't upgraded the doctrines perfectly. It is not such a bad idea to make use of your older ships, especially if you have a small navy. Obviously, though, you are going to want to build some more powerful ships. So, this would be a classic kind of cruiser squadron. Another type of fleet for nations that do have a very versatile navy, like the UK and the US. If you want to, one of the things you can do is you can put your battleships in one type of surface action group, and then you can create what I would call a fast cruiser squadron, something like this. With heavy cruisers, battlecruisers, and destroyers. What you're doing here is you're trying to get the maximum speed, and this is a fleet that's good for chasing wounded fleets and catching them and sealing the deal and sinking them. So if your battleship fleet defeats the fleet with the Tirpitz and the Bismarck, and you want to hunt them down and chase them down and actually sink them, then you might want to have a fast cruiser-based fleet with heavy cruisers and destroyers. This fleet will not be as powerful or defensible as a fleet that's structured around battleships, but it will be faster and it will be lethal at chasing down ships. Let's talk about your carrier task forces now, or carrier groups or carrier fleets. Carriers, unlike battleships, because of their firing range, if you are fighting against opponents that do not have carriers, carriers actually don't really need screens. They will be defensible. They will survive if they're engaged, because the enemy is very, very unlikely to catch up to them. So it is possible to use carriers on their own. It's always better to add screens, though. It's always better to add screens because it's just going to give them a little bit more bite. If the carrier air groups are able to reduce the organization and strength of the opponents, then having some light cruisers or destroyers present, those ships may be able to get within firing range and do some extra damage to the enemy fleets. So it's never a bad thing to have screens, but it's not totally necessary with carriers. How many should you have? I would tend to, because your admirals will gain skill faster if they are 1-star admirals, I would tend to at the beginning use the bare minimum of 3 screens for a carrier squadron. So something like this could be a very good fleet. It's generally preferable to use light cruisers with carriers because the fleet will have a longer range. However, it's also perfectly viable to use destroyers with carriers if you want a very, very fast carrier squadron, using a mix of the two. If you're fighting in the Pacific, if you're playing as Britain or Japan or the USA, and you're fighting enemies that have carrier fleets, mixing the two, as long as you've upgraded their statistics and upgraded their doctrines, mixing the two will give you a mix of speed and sea attack so that you'll actually sink more opponents. Keep in mind that carriers will be very, very good at winning naval battles at the beginning of the game, but they will not be particularly good at sinking ships because the torpedoes on your carrier air groups and the bombs on your carrier air groups are not going to be very good until you upgrade your air technologies, and you're going to want to upgrade your spotting technologies and your radar technologies. So your carrier air groups will win battles and will basically be indestructible in the early game, but you may want to have some surface fleets around to actually sink enemy ships. In the same way, if you de-org the enemy's CAGs and you're fighting in the Pacific, for example, you may want to very carefully dispatch a battleship squadron to actually go and sink the carriers, because the bigger guns on the battleship will do more damage. As your CAGs get better, as your carrier air groups get better over the course of the game, that becomes less necessary, and you will be able to sink more ships with carriers. Having fast carrier squadrons with only destroyers will also allow you to hunt down fleets that are limping home, to chase them when they flee into the adjacent province, and to sink them so that they're not able to go back to port and repair. Other types of fleets, let's talk about submarines. If you're playing as Germany or any country and you want to use submarines to do convoy hunting, the more submarines you put in a squadron, the more likely they are going to be to sink enemy convoys. They will do more damage, and they will be less likely to run away if there are too many escorts in the convoy. However, a fleet like this is very visible. By the way, you would never mix submarines with other types of ships. You always use submarines alone. If you mix in other types of ships, they lose their stealth advantage. If you build a big stack of submarines like this, it will sink a lot of convoys, but it will also be very easy to spot, and it will get intercepted by enemy fleets, and a lot of these submarines will be very, very quickly sunk. You would lose 4 or 5 or 6 submarines very easily in this fleet, and it's a total waste. So the ideal submarine squadron in terms of stealth for convoy hunting would be a single submarine. However, one of the most important things to remember in naval battles is that if you lose an entire fleet, you lose the admiral as well. You never lose the air, you lose your air leaders, and you never lose your land leaders, but you will lose your admirals if the entire fleet gets sunk. They basically drown. So I would consider a bare minimum sized fleet to be 3 submarines. Obviously, it's going to be more visible than 2 submarines, but if and when it does get engaged, it will be more likely to be able to limp home. At least one ship will survive and be able to limp home and save the life of your valuable admiral, because what's the point in increasing the skill of an admiral if he just dies? You also have a finite number of admirals, and there's no way to get new admirals. You get a few new ones every year, but you can very easily run out of skilled admirals, and you'd be in a bad spot, and your navy would basically be useless at that point. So this is the ideal. 3 submarines is the ideal submarine squadron, and you will want to be very careful about if you're playing as Germany in particular. You will want to be very careful about using outdated submarines with poor armor. and poor speed because they will not be able to run away from combats, and if they do get intercepted, they will be torn to shreds by the enemy's destroyers or other ships. What about submarine hunting? Submarine hunting is one of the most challenging parts of naval combat, especially against the AI. It's very, very difficult to hunt down subs. So the same thing applies for your early war anti-submarine warfare squadrons. A squadron that looks like this would be particularly good at destroying submarines. However, the enemy submarines would likely spot it and flee. So typically, you are going to want to reduce the size of your ASW squadron and do something like this. For the very same reason as for the submarines, if you put less than 3 ships, if it does happen to bump into, let's say you're playing as the UK, if you do happen to bump into one of Germany's heavy cruisers or battle cruisers, and you only have 1 or 2 destroyers, you could end up losing your admiral, which is not worth it. So in the early war, this is probably the ideal size. Once you get better air radar technologies and better air-launched torpedoes and bombs for your carrier air groups, the absolute best sub-hunting squadrons are going to look something like this. You can even put more destroyers in this squadron. I mean, obviously you want to use up-to-date destroyers that are fast so that they can catch up to the submarines and sink them and have bigger guns so that they can do more damage, and better ASW technologies. But a high-level escort carrier mixed with 5 high-level destroyers is an ideal late war anti-submarine squadron. These squadrons will rip through enemy subs fairly easily. What happens is the carrier air group will spot the enemy. The destroyers will rush forward using their speed to catch up to the submarines. So while your CAGs are bombing the subs and doing some damage, the destroyers will rush up, get within firing range, and seal the deal and sink the subs. So this is a good late war anti-submarine squadron. Convoys and escorts. Convoys are obviously what you need to either have trade deals or to ship supplies and resources overseas. Escorts are used to protect those. If I go into manual convoy mode here, I can manually set the number of escorts and convoys. So if I have a very valuable convoy route, I might want to do something like this, where I'm actually putting more escorts than convoys. This would make this fleet actually impervious to attack by submarines. It would be almost impossible for these convoys to be sunk. However, the disadvantage of using escorts as your main means of defending convoys is that both convoys and escorts cost IC, but they do not contribute to practical, so you never get faster at building them, and they basically are a total waste of IC. They do not contribute to your research, they do not contribute to your naval research or anything, so generally speaking, you want to do everything you can to avoid building more convoys than you need, and it's probably not a great strategy to be building escorts. What you should be doing is building fleets that can actually destroy enemy submarines and enemy fleets so that you snuff the problem out at its source. You can also do things like build naval bombers and bomb the submarines in port, or use naval strikes to bomb them in sea provinces, but it's always better to destroy submarines than it is to build tons of escorts that just eat up your IC and are useless. Let's talk about transport fleets. In terms of transport fleets, the same thing applies to all small fleets. A small stack of transport fleets is probably better than a large stack if you're going to be using them alone, because it's less likely to be spotted. If you are playing as a country that does not have a lot of transports, first of all, you don't want to get your transports sunk because you don't want to have entire divisions drown in the sea. So it may be a better idea to mix in mix in ships. First of all, you can get the shore bombardments advantage from using, say, an older battleship in your transport fleet if you are doing an amphibious operation, but it may be worthwhile to provide some escorts for your transport ships. Another way to do this is to build smaller battle fleets. If you're trying to stick to my limit of 12 ships per fleet, you could do something like build a fleet like this and use it separately from a transport from a transport fleet, or you could stack them together. Obviously, you can do the same thing with landing craft. It can also be effective to put carriers in with your transport fleets, mixing carriers with your transport fleets if you're doing like an invasion of Japan or an invasion of the USA. This is probably going to be the safest transport fleet, something like this, even one carrier, because the carrier will effectively prevent, especially if you want to send a lot of transports, like 10 transports, mixing in like a carrier and a light cruiser will basically prevent these transports from ever being engaged unless the carrier air groups are defeated. This is a very safe way to move huge numbers of troops across a long distance using transports, ships, landing craft, or assault ships. So, you know, either mix your transports in with your surface action groups or carrier task forces, or have fleets in the same province or nearby in case they do get engaged. One thing to keep in mind is that you should not keep transport ships in your fleets when they're not being used to transport ships, to transport units. If you're not transporting units, do not put transport ships in your fleets. They will get sunk. So only use them when you're actually transporting troops. So that pretty much covers off naval fleet design. I will be doing a video on naval combat at some points. Next episode is going to deal with province improvements and all these different things that you can build in provinces. We will talk about that next episode.